The neighborhood looked like something pulled straight out of a real estate brochure. Wide streets lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, identical rooftops painted in approved shades of beige and gray, and driveways so clean they reflected sunlight like glass. Every detail was controlled, measured, and enforced by the HOA board that proudly called itself the guardian of community standards. But beneath the polished surface, something else lived there too: pressure, constant, silent pressure to conform. At the edge of this carefully maintained world stood a modest single-story home that didn't quite match the rest. It wasn't broken or neglected, but it lacked the aggressive perfection the HOA demanded. The paint was slightly older. The garden was simple, practical, and not decorative enough by their standards. This was where the veteran lived. He was a Gulf War veteran, a man who had once operated in chaos where rules meant survival, not aesthetics. In this neighborhood, however, he had chosen silence over confrontation. He kept to himself, rarely attended HOA gatherings, and avoided unnecessary conversation. His routine was simple: early mornings in the small garden, repairing what needed fixing, and sitting quietly on his porch in the evenings. To him, the house wasn't a statement, it was shelter. But to the HOA board, especially its leadership, silence was not neutrality. It was defiance waiting to be corrected. The HOA president, a woman known for her strict interpretation of every rule in the handbook, had noticed his property early on. At first, it was subtle criticism during board meetings, mentions of inconsistent curb appeal or properties not meeting uniform expectations. No names were spoken at first, but everyone knew where those comments were aimed. The veteran never responded. That made things worse. In the HOA's world, silence was not peace, it was resistance without permission. Within months, the first official notice arrived. It was neatly printed, carefully worded, and attached to his front door like a warning disguised as courtesy. The grass was exceeding acceptable height variance. A small patch of paint near the window frame was deviating from approved exterior maintenance standards. He read it once, then quietly adjusted the grass and planned to repaint the frame over the weekend. He complied without argument. But compliance in this neighborhood was not enough. Because once the HOA notices you, it doesn't stop at correction, it escalates into observation. By the second month, another notice arrived. This time, it was about the color of his mailbox. Then came a warning about the alignment inconsistency of his driveway border stones, then a fine for a visible discrepancy in decorative landscaping. Each complaint felt smaller than the last, but together they formed a pattern that wasn't about maintenance, it was about control. Still, the veteran said nothing. His neighbors noticed the envelopes. Some glanced away when they saw him outside. Others whispered briefly but never stepped in. In HOA communities, involvement often came with risk, and most people preferred comfort over confrontation. The board interpreted the silence differently. To them, he wasn't just a resident failing to comply, he was someone who needed to be managed. And so the frequency of inspections increased. Every week brought another visit, another clipboard, another technical violation pulled from the rulebook like ammunition. What began as small corrections slowly turned into financial pressure. First came minor fines, then repeated penalties, then administrative fees attached to those penalties. Still, the veteran did not complain. He simply adjusted, repaired, and endured. But beneath that calm exterior was something the HOA never bothered to understand. This was not a man unfamiliar with pressure. He had lived through situations where decisions carried real consequences, where discipline wasn't enforced by paperwork but by survival itself. Yet here, in this quiet suburban world, he was treated as though he were the problem that needed fixing. And the more he complied, the more the system tightened around him. The neighborhood remained quiet on the surface. Lawns stayed green, mailboxes stayed aligned. But around one house, tension slowly began to grow, unspoken, unnoticed by most, but carefully nurtured by the HOA board that believed order required constant enforcement. And the veteran, still sitting on his porch each evening, watching the sunset over a perfectly controlled neighborhood, had no idea that what had started as a few notices was about to become something far more personal. The first real shift didn't happen loudly. It arrived quietly the same way everything in the neighborhood did, through a sealed envelope placed with deliberate precision at the veteran's front door. No knock, no conversation, just paper, authority without face. Inside was a new notice. This time it wasn't about grass height or paint tone. It was about repeated noncompliance patterns suggesting disregard for community standards. The wording was vague enough to feel threatening, yet formal enough to appear justified. The veteran stood on his porch for a long moment after reading it, the paper hanging loosely in his hand. The afternoon sun reflected off the perfectly aligned houses across the street, each one identical in their approved perfection. Somewhere beyond them, a lawnmower hummed like a reminder of how closely everything was being watched. He folded the notice once carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then he went back outside. He did not argue, he did not call anyone, he simply continued his routine. But inside the HOA office, that silence was being interpreted very differently. The HOA president sat at the head of a long conference table reviewing a stack of resident files. She was known for her precision, her strict interpretations, and her belief that order was not maintained, it was enforced. To her, neighborhoods did not stay beautiful on their own, they required discipline. And now she had a file that kept coming back into discussion. "The veteran," one board member said casually, flipping through papers, "still hasn't upgraded the exterior trim." Another member added, "He fixed the grass issue, but the mailbox alignment is still slightly off by HOA standard." The president tapped her pen against the table, "So he complies selectively." That phrase changed the tone of the room. Selective compliance in HOA language was no longer maintenance, it was defiance. Within a week, the next notice arrived. This time it included a fine. A small one officially, just enough to be procedural. But it was followed by another inspection, then another. Each visit became more invasive, less about checking and more about documenting. They measured his driveway cracks with rulers. They photographed the angle of his fence shadow at different times of day. They inspected his porch decorations to ensure nothing personally expressive violated aesthetic neutrality. To an outsider, it might have looked absurd. To the board, it was control. And to the veteran, it was becoming predictable. He still did not resist. That was the part that confused them most. Most residents either complied quickly or pushed back loudly. He did neither. He simply absorbed the process like weather, unpleasant, constant, but unavoidable. And that absence of reaction began to irritate the HOA leadership more than open rebellion ever could. At the next meeting, the tone shifted again. "We're not seeing corrective behavior," the president said firmly. "We're seeing tolerance of enforcement." One board member leaned forward. "Should we escalate?" The room went quiet for a moment. Escalation was a word they used carefully. It meant more fines, stricter timelines, and formal hearings. It meant pressure. The president nodded slowly. If a resident does not respond to correction, then structure must respond for them. And just like that, the process moved from observation to targeting. The next month was different. Inspections became scheduled and unscheduled. Notices arrived faster, sometimes overlapping before the previous one was even addressed. The fines stopped being symbolic and started accumulating in ways that mattered. The veteran's mailbox filled with paper reminders of his noncompliance history, each one referencing the last as justification for the next. Neighbors began to notice the pattern. Whispers started in driveways and over fences. Some said the HOA was being unusually strict. Others said rules were rules. Most avoided involvement altogether. But one thing was becoming clear, even without words. This was no longer about a lawn or a mailbox. It was about a single resident being singled out and measured against standards that seemed to shift whenever he met them. Still, he did not attend meetings. Still, he did not complain. And still, he did not give them the reaction they seemed to be waiting for. Which, in a system built on control, was the most unacceptable outcome of all. Because now the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. They were testing him. And they were becoming increasingly determined to see when, if ever, he would break. What began as small notices and minor fines slowly hardened into something far more persistent, something structured, deliberate, and almost ritualistic in its repetition. By the second year, the veteran was no longer just receiving violations. He was receiving systems of violations. Each month came with a new compliance review summary, listing every past issue as if it were still unresolved. Even corrections he had already completed were brought back into discussion, as though fixing them had only proven he was capable of being monitored more closely. The HOA called it ongoing community alignment. To him, it felt like being trapped inside a loop that never ended. He stopped being surprised when the envelopes arrived. He would find them in the morning, placed neatly against his door like clockwork, sometimes two at once. Sometimes one would reference another that had not yet been delivered. The contradictions didn't matter to the system. The system never corrected itself, it only expanded. And slowly his home became a case file. Inside the HOA office, his name came up so often that it stopped sounding like a resident and started sounding like an issue, a recurring topic, a standing agenda item. The president treated it that way. "He still hasn't upgraded the exterior fixtures," she said one evening, scanning a report, "and the landscaping variance is technically unresolved." A board member flipped through pages. "He did adjust it last month." She didn't look up, it reverted. No one questioned it, not loudly anyway. In HOA meetings, disagreement was often quieter than agreement. So the process continued. Inspections became more frequent, sometimes happening twice in a single week. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late in the evening when shadows made every imperfection easier to argue. They measured things no one else in the neighborhood cared about: fence spacing down to fractions, the angle of roof tiles, the shade variation of exterior paint under different lighting conditions. And each measurement became another violation, another fine, another entry in a growing record. The veteran's life, once simple and self-contained, slowly began to narrow. Not physically, his home remained the same, but socially, emotionally, and financially. The repeated fines started to accumulate into something heavier than inconvenience, something designed to push, even if no one said that out loud. Neighbors began to notice the pattern more clearly now. It wasn't random enforcement anymore. It was focused, selective. A few residents at first dismissed it as standard HOA strictness, but others started exchanging glances when notices were posted on his door. Conversations would stop when he walked past. People who once greeted him politely now hesitated, unsure whether association with him would draw attention. And that was the quiet power of the system. It didn't need to isolate him directly. It simply needed everyone else to step back. The veteran still didn't fight back. That was the part the board couldn't understand. They expected escalation, complaints, arguments, something to justify their growing attention. Instead, they got routine, adjustments, silence. Even when the tone of the notices shifted from formal to pointed, he remained unchanged. Final warning before further action. Non-responsive compliance behavior noted. Escalation eligibility initiated. The language grew sharper, but his response did not. Inside the HOA, frustration began to surface, not openly, but in how often his case was discussed. It stopped being about rules and started sounding personal, even though no one admitted it. "He's making this harder than it needs to be," one board member muttered during a meeting. Another replied, "Or he's hoping we'll stop." The president's expression remained controlled. "We don't stop enforcing standards because someone chooses not to cooperate." But something had shifted beneath her certainty. Because for 5 years, every mechanism they used, fines, inspections, pressure, repetition, had not produced the outcome they expected. He hadn't escalated. He hadn't left. And he hadn't broken. Instead, he had simply remained there, absorbing it all without reaction, like a fixed point in a system designed to move everything else. And that kind of persistence in a place built on control and compliance was beginning to feel less like resistance, and more like something they couldn't calculate anymore. The HOA meeting that night felt different from the moment the doors opened. The usual low chatter of residents settling into folding chairs was quieter than normal. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed harsher, casting a sterile glow over the room where years of disputes, votes, and quiet tensions had accumulated like dust. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, arranged like a panel of judges. The president was already there, reviewing documents with calm precision. Next to her lay a thick folder, thicker than usual, the veteran's file. Tonight wasn't routine. Tonight was final action. When the meeting was called to order, the president didn't waste time. She adjusted the microphone slightly, scanned the room, and opened the file. For the past several years, she began, her voice steady and formal, we have documented repeated noncompliance regarding Property 17B. The veteran sat halfway back in the room. He did not move. He rarely attended these meetings unless explicitly summoned, and even then he came without expression, without protest. Tonight was no different. He simply sat, hands folded, eyes forward. The president continued. Despite multiple warnings, fines, and correction opportunities, compliance has not been fully achieved. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knew who she was talking about. No names were needed anymore. She flipped a page. Therefore, the board is moving to enforce a lien on the property to recover outstanding penalties and initiate formal escalation procedures. The word lien hit the room harder than expected. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was a step toward loss of control over ownership itself. A murmur spread through the audience. The veteran still did not react. The president seemed almost satisfied by that silence now, as if it confirmed everything she believed about him. She looked up briefly. Is there any response from the resident? All eyes turned toward him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the veteran stood. The room quieted instantly, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't. He simply walked forward. Each step echoed slightly against the tiled floor. He reached the table at the front where the board sat and placed a stack of papers down carefully. Notices, fines, records, 5 years of them, neatly organized. He didn't slam them, he didn't scatter them. He just placed them there. Then he stepped back. Silence stretched. The president narrowed her eyes slightly. Do you have a statement? The veteran looked at her for the first time that night, not with anger, not with fear. Just acknowledgement. And then quietly he said nothing. That was it. No defense, no argument, no plea. Just silence. A few seconds passed, then someone in the audience shifted again, uncomfortable. The tension in the room thickened, filling the space where words were expected but never arrived. The president's expression hardened slightly. If there is no objection, she said, we will proceed with the vote. Hands raised on the board one by one. The vote passed. It was official. The lien would move forward. The veteran remained standing until the process ended. Then he turned and walked back to his seat, passing neighbors who avoided eye contact without even realizing they were doing it. As the meeting concluded, chairs scraped against the floor and conversations started again in low tones. People began filing out, discussing dinner plans, whether anything that wasn't what had just happened. But something lingered. Because for 5 years, they had expected a reaction. Anger. Resistance. A breaking point. Instead, they had gotten none of it. And that absence now felt heavier than any confrontation would have. Outside, the night air was calm when people finally stepped out of the building. Streetlights lined the quiet neighborhood like watchful markers. The veteran stood briefly near the exit, looking back at the building where it had all been decided. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't challenge the result. He simply left. But for the first time in years, something in the system they had built around him had shifted, not because he resisted it, but because he had reached the point where he no longer needed to. 2 days after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm as if nothing significant had happened. Lawns were trimmed, driveways were washed, curtains opened and closed at predictable hours. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The veteran still went about his routine, but there was a quiet heaviness around him now, like a chapter had closed without anyone fully understanding the ending. Then, on a late morning when the sun was high and the street was unusually still, a black military vehicle rolled slowly past the entrance gate of the neighborhood. It wasn't loud, it didn't rush. It simply arrived. The HOA security guard at the gate straightened immediately, unsure whether to question it. But before he could react, the vehicle stopped and a young man stepped out. He wore a crisp military uniform. Everything about him was controlled, his posture, his movement, the way his eyes scanned the street before locking onto a single destination. The veteran's house. Within minutes, whispers spread faster than the vehicle had arrived. "Is that his son? I didn't know he had a military family. Why is he here?" The young soldier didn't engage with the curiosity. He didn't acknowledge the neighbors watching from windows or behind half-closed doors. He simply walked straight to the HOA office. Inside the building, the board was in a routine administrative session when the door opened without warning. The room fell silent. The soldier stepped in holding a folder marked with official seals and documentation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't introduce himself. He placed the folder on the table. "I need records," he said calmly. "All enforcement actions taken against Property 17B for the last 5 years." The president blinked, surprised but composed. "Excuse me." He met her eyes. "You heard me." There was something in his tone that didn't feel like a request. It felt like procedure. The room shifted uncomfortably. One board member cleared his throat. "We can provide standard records upon formal request." The soldier nodded slightly. "This is a formal request." He slid additional documents onto the table, authorizations, identifiers, and correspondence codes that immediately changed the energy in the room. The board members glanced at each other. This wasn't just a resident's complaint anymore. This had structure behind it. The president leaned forward. "What exactly is your involvement in this matter?" The soldier paused for a fraction of a second. "My father has been under continuous targeted enforcement," he said evenly. "I'm here to verify the legitimacy of that process." The word targeted landed heavily. A few board members shifted in their seats. The president forced a small smile. "All enforcement actions are based on HOA guidelines." The soldier didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened his folder and began placing pages on the table one by one. Each page was labeled. Each violation recorded. Each fine categorized. And then something changed in the tone of the room. Because the documentation wasn't just HOA paperwork. It was structured, auditable, cross-referenced, and inconsistent. Very inconsistent. Dates overlapped, violations were repeated under different categories. Some infractions were recorded after they had already been marked resolved. Others lacked required signatures or inspection confirmations. The board member next to the president frowned. "That can't be right." The soldier looked up. "It is right, that's why I'm here." Silence followed again, but this time it wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of realization beginning to form. Outside the office, through the glass windows, neighbors had started gathering. Word had spread quickly that something official was happening, something serious. And for the first time in years, the HOA board wasn't in control of the narrative. The soldier closed the folder. "I'll be requesting a full external review," he said calmly, "and I suggest you preserve all internal records." The president's expression tightened slightly. On what authority? The soldier looked at her directly. And for the first time, there was no ambiguity in the room. On the authority of verification, he said. Then he turned and walked out. And as the door closed behind him, the board members sat in a silence that felt very different from all the ones before it. Because this time, they weren't waiting for a reaction. They were waiting for consequences.